indispensable element in building the new prosperity is closely related to creating
nations involved before becoming effective.
Multilateral economic cooperation, a crucial launching pad for the world's post-war.
In 1944, two men walked into a hotel in New Hampshire to decide who would control the world's money. One was the most famous economist alive. The other was a Soviet spy. The man who won is the reason the dollar runs the planet today. A hotel was the Mount Washington Hotel. The state was New Hampshire. The month was July 1944.
Our world, and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
World War II was still on. D-Day had happened just 3 weeks earlier. Soldiers were still dying in Normandy, while these men sat down to dinner. And while the war was being fought in Europe and the Pacific, 44 countries quietly sent 730 delegates to a tiny mountain resort in the United States. For 22 days, behind closed doors, they wrote the rules of global money. The rules you are still living under right now, more than 80 years later. This is the story of Bretton Woods, the meeting almost nobody talks about anymore. The meeting that decided who the rich countries would be and who the poor countries would be for generations. To understand why Bretton Woods mattered, you have to understand what had just happened. The 1930s had been a disaster. The Great Depression had wiped out economies. Countries reacted by closing their borders, raising tariffs, devaluing their currencies to undercut each other. World trade collapsed. Joblessness exploded. And out of that economic wreckage came the politics of fascism, communism, and a Second World War that was now killing tens of millions of people. The American and British governments looked at all of that and made a decision. When this war ends, we are not doing this again. We will design a global money system that prevents another Great Depression. A system stable enough that countries trade with each other instead of fight each other. A system that an entire continent can rebuild on. That was the goal. The problem was deciding who got to write the rules. The British sent John Maynard Keynes. By 1944, Keynes was the most influential economist alive. His ideas had remade economic policy across half the world. He arrived at Bretton Woods sick. He had a heart condition that would kill him 2 years later, but he came with a plan. Keynes wanted a global currency, not the dollar, not the pound, a new one. He called it Bancor. He wanted an international clearing union that would manage trade between nations. And crucially, he wanted both deficit countries and surplus countries to share the burden of fixing imbalances. If your country was running a huge surplus year after year, you would pay a penalty to push that money back into the system. The Americans sent Harry Dexter White. White was a Treasury official, not a household name, not a Nobel-level economist, but he was running the conference, and he had a completely different plan. White wanted the United States dollar at the center of everything. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed price. Surplus countries would not be punished. Trade imbalances would be the borrower's problem. There was something else about Harry Dexter White that no one in that hotel knew. Years later, declassified US intelligence intercepts, the Venona files, would identify White as a Soviet source. He had been passing information to Soviet intelligence for years. In 1948, he was hauled before Congress to answer for it. He died of a heart attack 3 days after his testimony. Whether his Soviet ties affected his work at Bretton Woods is still debated by historians. What is not debated is that he was the architect of the deal that put the dollar on top. So why did White's plan win and not Keynes's? 3 words: gold, power, money. At the end of World War II, the United States held roughly 3/4 of the world's monetary gold. 3/4. Every major economy except America had been bombed, occupied, or both. Britain was bankrupt. France was rubble. Germany and Japan were defeated. The Soviet Union was devastated. The US was the only major economy with intact factories, an intact financial system, and a mountain of gold. When the country with the gold and the factories tells you what the new system looks like, you nod and you sign. What they signed looked like this. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Any government holding dollars could, in theory, exchange them for gold from the US Treasury at that price. Every other currency in the system would be pegged to the dollar within a narrow band of about 1%. The world had stable exchange rates again, and it had a single anchor, the American dollar, backed by American gold, run from American banks. Bretton Woods also created two institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to police the exchange rate system and lend to countries in trouble, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, what we now call the World Bank, to fund reconstruction and later development. Both institutions were placed in Washington, D.C. Both were structured so that voting power was weighted by economic size. The bigger your economy, the more votes you got. Guess who had the biggest economy? The United States got an effective veto. To this day, major decisions at the IMF require an 85% supermajority. The US holds just over 15% of the votes. Do the math. Nothing major happens at the IMF without American consent. For 27 years, the system worked. The world entered the longest stretch of broadly stable growth in modern history. The Marshall Plan poured over $13 billion, close to $170 billion in today's money, into rebuilding Western Europe between 1948 and 1952. American factories shipped tractors, steel, and machinery across the Atlantic. European industry came back to life on American credit. Japan rebuilt. International trade boomed. Currencies stayed where they were supposed to stay. The French call this period the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. American kids grew up in suburbs. European countries built welfare states. The middle class expanded almost everywhere, all of it sitting on top of a hotel meeting in 1944. And then it cracked. Economists have a name for the trap, the Triffin Dilemma, named after Belgian economist Robert Triffin, who in 1960 warned the US Senate that Bretton Woods could not work forever. The problem was simple. The world needed more and more dollars to grow, but the more dollars the US printed, the less credible the gold backing became. Either you starve the world of dollars and choke global growth, or you flood the world with dollars and break the peg. Triffin was right. It just took 11 more years to prove. By the 1960s, the United States was running into that exact problem. The Vietnam War was expensive. President Johnson's Great Society programs were expensive. To pay for both, the US government printed more dollars. A lot more dollars. The number of dollars in circulation kept climbing, while the pile of gold in Fort Knox stayed roughly the same. Foreign governments started doing math. France, under Charles de Gaulle, started showing up at the US Treasury and demanding gold for its dollars. Other countries followed. The gold started leaving the United States, faster and faster. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and ended Bretton Woods. He called it a temporary suspension. It was not. From that day forward, you could no longer convert dollars to gold. The dollar was suddenly worth whatever the market said it was worth. Within 2 years, the entire fixed exchange rate system had collapsed into floating currencies. But here's the twist. The dollar should have lost its crown when Nixon broke the gold peg. It did not. 2 years later, in 1973, the United States made another deal that extended its monetary dominance for another half-century. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the Saudi government agreed to a simple bargain. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would protect Saudi Arabia militarily. Every country on Earth that wanted oil, which is every country on Earth, suddenly needed dollars to buy it. They sold goods to America to get those dollars. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by oil. So if Bretton Woods is dead, why are we still talking about it? Because the architecture survived. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency. As of 2024, roughly 58% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Around 88% of all international currency transactions involve the dollar on one side of the trade. Oil is still priced in dollars. Most international debt is denominated in dollars. The IMF still exists. The World Bank still exists. Both are still headquartered in Washington. Both are still voted on by economic size. And the United States still has its effective veto. Bretton Woods set the table. Everyone is still eating off it. This is where the developed and developing divide gets baked in. When poor countries hit a crisis, and they hit them often because their economies are smaller and more exposed, they go to the IMF. The IMF lends, but the IMF attaches conditions. In the 1980s and 1990s, those conditions became known as structural adjustment programs. Cut government spending, open your markets, privatize state companies, devalue your currency. The list of countries pushed through this is long. Argentina, Mexico, Indonesia, Russia, half the African continent. The most famous case came in 1997, when the IMF moved into Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea during the Asian financial crisis. The fund forced those governments to raise interest rates, slash spending, and bail out banks. The medicine made the crisis worse before it got better. Indonesia's economy contracted around 13% in a single year. The government fell. Across Southeast Asia, the IMF stopped being a rescuer and started looking like a creditor with a whip. Economists call this the Washington Consensus, because the rules came out of Washington, applied by an institution born in a New Hampshire hotel in 1944. The rest of the world has noticed. In 2014, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, set up their own new development bank. In 2016, China launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Both are direct challenges to the World Bank and IMF. Some countries are pricing oil and other goods in non-dollar currencies. Russia and China are settling trade in yuan and rubles. The dollar share of global reserves is slowly slipping. Not collapsing, slipping. We are watching the long, quiet end of the system Bretton Woods built. It will not end in a single meeting at a New Hampshire hotel. It will end the way these things always end, in pieces. A trade deal here, a currency swap there, a central bank quietly diversifying out of dollars over a decade, until one day the dollar will not be the only game in town, and the architecture that 730 men signed off on in 22 days in 1944 will finally be replaced by something else. But it has not happened yet. Right now, in 2026, the dollar in your hand, the price on a barrel of oil, the loan your government took from the IMF, all of it still runs on the rules written in a hotel in the White Mountains during a war. Bretton Woods is the most important meeting you have never heard of. It decided who the rich countries would be and who the poor countries would be. It decided which currency you save in, which currency you owe in, and which country gets to print the money the rest of the world has to use. Two men walked into a hotel in 1944. One had a vision of shared global money. The other had a vision of American money on top. The American won, and we are all still his. Geography decides money. Geography decides power. And in the summer of 1944, geography decided the next century.